Freddie and I work at the University of South Wales, and this is my third video for Global Game Jam Next, and it's going to be on exporting assets for use in your games. Okay, so the first thing to bear in mind when you're trying to create assets is that if you don't get the asset production right, then you're going to potentially have an awful lot of wasted effort if you are unable to export the asset in the right format for the game engine that you're using. So one of the classic ones here is FBX format, which is used for 3D models in things like Unity, Unreal, and so on. And if you can't export into that format, then all the amazing modeling that you're doing in Maya, 3D Studio Max, or Blender, etc., will be pretty much a waste of effort. So the most important thing is for the engine that you're chosen, look for the guidelines. Now, I know Unity and Unreal Epic Games and a variety of other game engine sites have really good guidelines or tips, tutorials, etc. on how to create art assets for those games. So one of the first things you want to do is actually look at some of those guidelines, see what the game engine producers are telling you are the right formats, etc. But also bear in mind that we also have the issue of the target platform as well. So, for example, I've recently been doing a handheld VR app using Unreal Engine, and it's supposed to run on Android and iOS platforms. And that's all very well. Android's fairly forgiving. iOS is not so forgiving, and several of the textures that we produced or used for the VR game just didn't appear at all in the iPad versions of the games. And the reason for that was because for although the engine worked and it worked for Android, I beg your pardon, the iOS implementation of the engine required what they call power of two. So the thing about power of two is they're expecting textures, and this is what the problem was with this particular thing, expecting textures to be nice square textures or combinations of squares. So they're expecting things to be in 64 by 64. Maybe you could have 64 by 128. The magic thing here being that these numbers are powers of two. And that's very common. It improves the way in which textures are handled, the way in which they're mapped in memory. Time was back when we were much more restricted on the amount of RAM or ROM that the games would come on if it's cartridge based. Was so small and it had to be so optimized that power of two kind of almost becomes a default way of thinking for experienced game developers. But it isn't necessarily so much now, when game engines generally are fairly forgiving and you can just slap a texture on there and it doesn't really matter how many pixels by how many pixels it is. But even little things like that can make a difference. So it's definitely worthwhile reading up on the guidelines that your engine of choice manufacturer is producing. So what are the other issues that you might want to think about when you're exporting assets for use in your games? Well, one of the first one is to look at examples. So look at some of the kind of like marketplace assets, tutorial materials, and so on, because they'll often be examples of the kind of format that you want. And it's worth experimenting with these, taking these things where you can edit them, play around with them, re-import them into the engine so you feel confident that what you're doing is okay, because sometimes it's very odd and you can create something you think is absolutely fine, and yet when you try and put it into engine, it's a 3D model, suddenly it's got huge spikes everywhere or the animation's not running properly. So it's actually worth experimenting as well. So use examples and play around with examples, from some of these tutorials and marketplace assets, but also experiment as well. Whenever I'm playing with a new format or a new engine, I always try to create something small and really simple and just try and import it into the engine. So if it's a 3D model, I'll make a little cube, maybe add a bone and a little simple animation of it just wobbling about. And then I'll try and import that into engine to see what problems there are. Because often art asset production products like Maya, 3D Studio Max, etc., you've got to set specific settings in order to make those exports work properly. One of the classic ones is if you're modeling in a 3D Studio Max, for example, you might have lights in there or other kind of extraneous things that you don't really need for the model. And yet, when you import them into the engine, you've taken those things along when you shouldn't have done. So it's about stripping back to just the things you need, setting the correct settings for the export, and often again in the guidelines there'll be tutorials that will give you good advice as to how to work from example packages into others. Now, one of the things about 3D modeling particularly is that generally game engine manufacturers tend to favor either Maya or 3D Studio Max. And there's been a kind of big battle between the two in terms of which has provenance. Although they're owned by the same company now, there were definitely studios that were Maya based and studios that were Max based, and they both have their place. They just do the same thing in slightly different ways. And bearing in mind that we also have things like Blender, for 3D aficionados who don't want to spend any. And there's student versions of these things as well. So that's the thing. Look at examples and experiment. Play around with small things. Make sure you feel comfortable and happy that you're working with that. Same thing with sound files. Now, one of the things, again, based on target platforms, is this idea of different sound formats. So there's WAV, there's MP3, there's OGG, there's a whole load of different types. So look at the tutorials and see what format those sounds are. Look for templates or examples and look at those things and try and as much as you can to work with the formats that they've given you. And there should be guidelines for what settings like not frame, sorry, beg your pardon, frequency, stereo, mono, and so all these kind of things. It's common sense, really. It's common sense. So the other thing about exporting assets for use in your games is not about the technicalities of what the game engines are wanting, but about good communication between the people making the art assets and the programmers. So some of these issues are about, one of them is about scale. Now, if you've got several people making 2D or especially 3D art assets, when you make something in a virtual environment like 3D Studio Max or Maya, it doesn't exist in the real world. It's just concepts, triangles, and so on. So, but scale is important because most game engines, particularly 3D game engines, they are using physics, they're using materials, they're making all sorts of assumptions about the mass or the qualities of the 3D model that you're importing into the engine. And it is important to get scale correct. So again, go back to those guidelines and see, okay, what is the number of inches or centimeters or pixels or whatever it is that you're using that is the correct kind of value to be working to. So if you imagine that you made a character model, and there he is, there's my character model, and I also made a chair, and that was the scale of the chair to the model, then I've just done a lot of work for nothing. I've made this massive, great big, giant sized chair that doesn't work with the character model because it should be half the height of the character model. And you'd be surprised how common that is, that people make something in isolation and they don't think about how it's going to look in engine. And the classic one is, can't you rescale it in engine? Well, you can rescale models in engine, but if you're making a 3D model for a 3D engine, and you put it in at one size, its collision box, its physics, all these kind of things are often assumed from the size of the object. You then shrink it down, you can get all sorts of problems. Trust me, you really, really can. So it's worthwhile making it the correct scale rather than making it super big and then asking the programmers to scale it down when they're doing level design. So good communication scale. So the other thing about exporting assets for use in your games is trying to be really economical. If you can, reuse, repurpose, particularly if you've got the rights to do it, make use of existing assets and say change the colors or tweak them a little bit here and there. Some art assets, excuse me, it's not possible to export from the game engine back into a 3D modeling package in order to play around with. So you might have to do stuff in engine, which is technically possible, but maybe a little bit difficult. It's also important that you keep the raw, pure assets separate from those that are imported into the game engine. So, for example, in Unreal Engine, if you import a texture from a ping or from a JPEG, etc., it'll create its own asset inside its the project folders with a .u asset format. And it's not possible to then go back and effectively re-edit those things. So it's worthwhile keeping your raw assets separate, editing those, and then re-importing those into the assets for the engine. And Unity works in a similar way. I'm sure some of the other engines do as well. So the big thing here is to be economical. So you want to reuse if you can. You want to repurpose if you can. And most importantly, you want to only produce the things that are actually going to be used. So one of the first things you can do in terms of making art assets available for use in your engine is this idea of placeholders. And this goes back to the idea that we mentioned before about experimentation. So if you want to, if you're creating a 2D game, for example, and you want your character sprite to be 64 by 128 pixels, so there's our bounding box. That's our character sprite there. We could just use a box. I mean, Mike Bithell did it and Thomas was alone, and you just pretty much stop there. Just had a cube. Oh, sorry, not even a cube, a square or a rectangle, and so different sizes. Use that, and then once you've got that working, you can even just sketch in something really simple, like a walk cycle with kind of 2, maybe 3 frames, and then put that in. And then you could see how the game is working. You could know that the programmers or the level designers are able to actually make the animations run at the first time, and it's not cost you more than a few minutes of just quickly sketching. Excuse me, quickly sketching something as a kind of placeholder. You can then go back in and create the nice art and do the proper collision boxes and all these other things. So placeholders, get them in early, get something quick so that the programs can start working with something and level designers can start working with something. Because one of the big things to bear in mind is this idea of the pipeline. So let me get rid of some of this. So if you've got artists, designers, programmers, etc., all working together on a game, they start here and they end here. So this is the end and this is the start. One of the problems that you get is that the designers tend to have a bit of a spike here, and then the kind of general concepts are put in place. And when they're kind of doing level design, they kind of like repeat, repeat, repeat. And particularly towards the end, programmers, excuse me, sorry, programmers tend to have not that much to do initially. Maybe do some little test things, and it's giving them something to do because their work will kind of ramp up towards the end. And similarly, for the artists, their work is going to start off around about when everyone's got a good idea what they're doing, and often it'll tail off. So what you want to do is to kind of prioritize when you're doing what art assets. And I guess that in a way, I'm kind of almost going beyond the bounds of what we're supposed to be talking about here. But it's about if you can use these placeholders, get something in there quick, and then you can refine, refine, refine. You know you've got the right size, the right scale, or that you can export the model correctly, and then it's not wasted effort. You won't get any surprises around here when the programmers and the designers are screaming for art assets that should have been ready there. And you haven't quite got them in, and then you put them in and they're the wrong size, and that 3D Space Marine won't actually fit through the doors that all the level designers were putting in around about the middle of the project. So I guess in a way, we've expanded a little bit from just the idea of exporting art assets for use in your games to the abstract, to the meta elements of what you need to do in order to not waste effort, waste time, and frustrate everybody, particularly yourself. Anyway, I hope that was useful, and I look forward to playing all your games.